At 0735 hours on June 6, 1944, Company Sergeant Major Charles Martin of the Queen's Own Rifles of Canada crouched in a landing craft approaching Brignais-sur. The 25-year-old from Cooksville, Ontario, studied the beach ahead, aware that intelligence reports predicted severe casualties. That morning, 14,000 Canadian troops were set to assault Juno Beach. Allied commanders questioned whether the Canadians could succeed. Martin had been with the Queen's Own Rifles since June 1940, when the regiment mobilized for war. He had trained in England for 4 years, advancing from rifleman to company sergeant major, one of the youngest in the regiment's history. Now he commanded a company facing its most significant trial. The men around him were farmers, factory workers, and shop clerks from across Ontario, most of whom had never seen combat. They had trained extensively, but training was not war. The memory of Dieppe haunted every Canadian soldier. That 1942 raid had killed or captured over 3,000 Canadians in 9 hours. Military planners remembered Dieppe and feared Juno Beach would suffer the same fate. The defensive position ahead, designated Widerstandsnest 27, was a German strongpoint built into Brignais. The Wehrmacht's 716th Infantry Division had fortified the coastline with 75 mm guns, machine gun emplacements, concrete bunkers, barbed wire, and mines, having spent 3 years preparing these defenses. Allied doctrine recommended a 3:1 numerical advantage to assault fortified beaches, a margin the Canadians did not have. The naval bombardment ceased before the landing craft reached shore, giving German defenders time to recover. Only 14% of beach fortifications had been destroyed by the preliminary shelling. General Dwight Eisenhower approved the Juno Beach operation on February 12, 1944. He knew Juno, positioned between Gold and Sword beaches, was among the most heavily defended portions of Hitler's Atlantic Wall. Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery inspected the 3rd Canadian Infantry Division in March 1944, noting Canadian enthusiasm but questioning their combat readiness. Despite his reservations, he assigned them to Juno Beach. Someone had to take it. Major General Rodney Keller commanded the division. A 1920 graduate of the Royal Military College, Keller had served with the Princess Patricia's Canadian Light Infantry for 2 decades. His division comprised soldiers from every Canadian province. They had trained relentlessly in England for 4 years, preparing for an invasion that kept being postponed. The challenge was not preparation but expectation. Canadian soldiers knew what Allied commanders thought of them. British officers dismissed them as colonials, American generals barely acknowledged them in planning meetings. Within the Allied command structure, Canada was Britain's junior partner, permitted to participate but not expected to lead or excel. That skepticism weighed on the Canadians as they crossed the English Channel on the night of June 5. The first casualties occurred before reaching shore. Landing craft struck German mines and detonated. German 75 mm guns fired directly into approaching vessels. Approximately 30% of the landing craft at Juno were destroyed or damaged. Soldiers reaching the beach confronted withering fire from German positions designed to sweep the coastline horizontally. Men fell in groups as they ran toward the seawall. Company B of the Royal Winnipeg Rifles lost half its strength in the first 10 minutes. The Queen's Own Rifles suffered 143 casualties on June 6, the highest of any Canadian battalion. The North Shore Regiment from New Brunswick lost 125 men, and the Regina Rifles 108. Martin's landing craft touched down at 0755 hours. As the ramp dropped, German machine gun fire erupted. Martin later recounted that he saw no evidence the preliminary bombardment had damaged German defenses. The beach appeared untouched. Soldiers waded through chest-deep water toward shore under continuous fire. Martin reached the seawall, but many did not. Within minutes, dozens of Queen's Own Rifle soldiers lay dead or wounded on the sand. By 0900 hours, despite staggering casualties, the Canadians held their ground. German commanders expected the attack to collapse. General Lieutenant Wilhelm Richter of the 716th Infantry Division anticipated failure, recalling Dieppe, but he misjudged the Canadians' resolve. What Richter failed to realize was that the Canadians had learned from Dieppe. Every mistake from that disaster had been meticulously studied. The Canadian Army had spent 2 years refining assault tactics for beach landings, training with specialized armor, including duplex-drive amphibious tanks, and practicing infantry armor coordination until instinctive. Most importantly, they trained fueled by determination born from Dieppe's memory. Every soldier at Juno carried the weight of that earlier failure and refused to repeat it. Martin led his company through a gap in the seawall at approximately 0915 hours. German resistance remained fierce. A machine gun nest in a concrete pillbox controlled the street ahead. Martin and his men used grenades and concentrated rifle fire to suppress the defenders, clearing the position and pushing into Brigny. The fighting devolved into intense, house-to-house combat. Germans defended from within buildings, firing from windows and doorways. The Canadians adapted, using explosives to breach interior walls and moving between buildings while avoiding street fire, clearing houses room by room, floor by floor in brutal, methodical fashion. By 1000 hours, the Queen's Own Rifles had secured the eastern section of Brigny-sur despite heavy losses. To the west, the Royal Winnipeg Rifles and Regina Rifles Regiment fought similar battles at Courseau-sur, a town split by the Soy River and fortified along both approaches. Both regiments faced relentless fire from positions that had survived the naval bombardment. Through aggressive infantry assaults supported by tanks from the 1st Hussars and Fort Garry Horse Regiments, Canadian forces cleared beach strongpoints by mid-morning. By 1100 hours, units were pushing inland. Allied planners expected the beach fight to last the entire day. Montgomery's orders assumed securing the beach and coastal towns would be the maximum D-Day achievement. The Canadians exceeded expectations dramatically. The 9th Canadian Infantry Brigade, held in reserve, landed at Brigny at 1140 hours. Brigade Commander Brigadier Douglas Cunningham immediately advanced his units inland. The North Nova Scotia Highlanders and Sherbrooke Fusiliers formed a combined arms column, driving south toward Breville. They moved swiftly, bypassing German resistance where possible and engaging only when necessary, pushing the invasion forward beyond what Allied planners had anticipated. This rapid advance created an unexpected situation. The German 21st Panzer Division stationed south of Caen had been ordered to counterattack the invasion beaches. They expected to hit Allied forces still struggling to establish beachheads. Instead, Canadian units were already 8 to 12 kilometers inland, moving faster than any other Allied division on any beach. At 1300 hours, elements of the Sherbrooke Fusiliers reached the main road between Caen and Bayeux. This was the objective Allied planners hoped to reach by nightfall. The Canadians achieved it by early afternoon. That accomplishment represented something profound. For the first time in the war, a Canadian force not only met expectations, but dramatically exceeded them. Every other Allied division on D-Day faced similar or lighter German resistance. American forces at Omaha Beach fought heroically, but gained less than 2 kilometers. British forces at Gold and Sword Beaches advanced 5 to 6 kilometers. The Canadians at Juno Beach penetrated 10 to 12 kilometers. Inland, the deepest Allied penetration of June 6, 1944. Success created new dangers. The rapid Canadian advance opened a gap between their eastern flank and British forces from Sword Beach. German commanders noticed. General Edgar Feidinger, commanding the 21st Panzer Division, saw an opportunity. His division had 75 tanks and supporting infantry. At 1600 hours, German armor attacked through the gap. Canadian and British forces fought German tanks with limited anti-tank support. The line held through 4 hours of intense fighting. At 2000 hours, a massive formation of Allied gliders flew overhead, carrying reinforcements for the British 6th Airborne Division. The sight convinced Feidinger that Allied air superiority was absolute. He withdrew. The counterattack collapsed. By nightfall on June 6, the Canadians achieved what no one expected. They secured all beach objectives, cleared for coastal towns, advanced 12 kilometers inland, and linked up with British forces on both flanks. The cost was significant. 340 Canadians were killed. 574 were wounded, 47 were captured, but the mission succeeded beyond every projection. British historian John Keegan later wrote that at the end of June 6, Canadian forward elements stood deeper into France than those of any other division. The opposition Canadians faced was stronger than any beach except Omaha. That accomplishment merited considerable pride. Martin survived D-Day. He fought through Normandy and was awarded the Distinguished Conduct Medal for actions following the landing at Juno Beach. He later earned the Military Medal for courage during an attack in Germany in March 1945. He returned to Canada in August 1945 and settled near Cooksville where he grew up. He and his wife operated a post office and general store while he worked for the Ontario Department of Agriculture. Martin remained active in his community as a school trustee and volunteer. For the 50th anniversary of D-Day in 1994, he wrote a memoir titled Battle Diary that remains among the most vivid portrayals of ordinary Canadian soldiers in the war. Martin died in October 1997. Mississauga named a trail after him and erected the Charlie Martin Memorial to recognize his wartime service and community contributions. The German Army noticed Canadian performance immediately. Bemarked intelligence reports from June 7 described the Canadian advance as unexpectedly aggressive and professionally executed. German commanders who dismissed Canadians as inexperienced colonials revised their assessments overnight. After action, reports from the 716th Infantry Division noted that Canadian infantry demonstrated excellent small unit tactics, effective use of supporting armor, and remarkable battlefield adaptation. One German officer wrote that Canadians fought with intensity he had not seen since the Eastern Front. Allied command took longer to acknowledge Canadian capabilities. Montgomery praised the 3rd Canadian Infantry Division in official reports, but privately expressed surprise at their performance. American commanders focused on their sectors and paid little attention to Canadian achievements. Full recognition came only after weeks of continued Canadian success throughout the Normandy campaign. Before D-Day, Canadian forces had already proven themselves in the Mediterranean. The 1st Canadian Infantry Division and 1st Canadian Armored Brigade landed in Sicily on July 10, 1943 as part of Operation Husky. Initial resistance was light as Italian coastal divisions surrendered quickly. The advance through Sicily proved harder as German forces conducted fighting withdrawals using mountainous terrain. Canadian troops fought through intense heat across difficult terrain against skilled defenders. The town of Leyenfort fell to the Loyal Edmonton Regiment after 3 days of house-to-house fighting. Adjara required coordinated attacks by multiple Canadian units supported by artillery. By August 7, when Axis forces evacuated Sicily, Canadian troops had fought continuously for 4 weeks, gaining invaluable lessons about combined arms warfare, mountain fighting, and urban combat. The Italian mainland campaign began September 3, 1943, when Canadian forces crossed the Strait of Messina and landed at Raio, Calabria. The advance up the Italian peninsula became a brutal advance through mountains, rivers, and German defensive lines. The Moraro River crossing in December 1943 cost 1,400 Canadian casualties. The river was narrow, but German positions on the north bank commanded every approach. Canadian infantry attacked across open ground under heavy fire, while engineers built bridges under continuous shelling. Ortona came next. The medieval town sat on cliffs overlooking the Adriatic Sea. Narrow streets and stone buildings made it ideal for defense. German 1st Parachute Division held Ortona with orders to defend every house. Canadian forces attacked on December 20. The Loyal Edmonton Regiment and C4th Highlanders of Canada, supported by tanks from the Three Rivers Regiment, pushed into the town. German defenders booby-trapped buildings, mine streets, and positioned machine guns to cover every approach. Canadians developed mauseling tactics out of necessity. Moving through streets meant certain death. Moving through buildings by blasting holes in walls allowed progress, while minimizing casualties. Soldiers fought room to room, often at point-blank range. Tank guns fired into Buildings at close range, bringing down structures on German defenders. Christmas Day 1943 found Canadian soldiers still fighting in Ortona with no ceasefire. Finally, on December 28, German forces withdrew. 1,375 Canadians died in the Moraro River battles, including Ortona. British historian John Keegan called Ortona Canada's Stalingrad, comparing it to brutal Eastern Front urban fighting. The battle demonstrated Canadian soldiers could match German elite troops in the most difficult conditions. German commanders who fought at Ortona wrote afterward that they underestimated Canadian tactical ability and fighting spirit. They expected to hold Ortona indefinitely. Canadian determination and innovative tactics forced them out in 8 days. When operations resumed in May 1944, Canadians participated in massive Allied offensives aimed at breaking through the Gustav Line and capturing Rome. 1st Canadian Corps, now including both 1st Canadian Infantry Division and 5th Canadian Armoured Division, attacked in the WWII Valley. Canadian troops, supported by massive artillery, assaulted fortified positions across open ground. Tank battles raged across wheat fields. Infantry fought through villages and strongpoints. The Hitler Line fell to Canadian and British forces. On May 23, Rome was liberated. June 4, Canadian troops were among the first Allied soldiers to enter the city. The Italian campaign cost Canada over 25,000 casualties, including more than 5,800 killed. But Canadian forces gained invaluable combat experience. Officers who later commanded in Northwest Europe learned their trade in Italy. Soldiers who landed in Sicily as green troops left Italy as veterans. The battle for Caen became the next major test in Northwest Europe. After D-Day, German forces concentrated around Caen, determined to prevent Allied breakout from the beachhead. Caen sat at strategic crossroads controlling access to the French interior. Montgomery ordered repeated attacks throughout June and July. Many fell to Canadian forces. The fighting was brutal. German SS Panzer divisions, including the 12th SS Hitler Youth Division, defended with fanatical determination. These experienced troops expected to crush inexperienced Canadians. They found themselves fighting equals. The 12th SS Division was particularly vicious, composed largely of teenage volunteers indoctrinated in Nazi ideology. They fought with reckless aggression. On June 7, elements of the 12th SS counterattacked Canadian positions at Ory and Buron. The North Nova Scotia Highlanders and Sherbrooke Fusiliers fought a day-long battle against superior German armor. Canadian losses were heavy with 128 killed and 89 wounded, but the line held. German forces failed to drive Canadians back to the coast. More troubling were reports that 12th SS troops executed Canadian prisoners. At the Abbaye d'Ardennes, German soldiers shot 20 Canadian prisoners. At other locations, wounded Canadians were killed. These war crimes enraged Canadian forces and changed rules of engagement. Fighting around Caen dragged through June into July. Carpick Airfield, a D-Day objective still uncaptured, became the focus of Operation Windsor in early July. The Royal Winnipeg Rifles and Regina Rifle Regiment, supported by Fort Garry horse tanks, attacked German positions at the airfield. The assault began at 0500 hours on July 4. German resistance was bile-days, ferocious. Every hangar, building, and meter of runway was contested. Canadian infantry advanced under heavy machine gun and mortar fire. Tanks knocked out German anti-tank positions, but took losses from concealed 88mm guns. By evening, Canadians controlled most of the airfield, but German forces held adjacent Carpet Village. Fighting continued through July 5. On July 6, German defenders withdrew. The airfield was secured, but Canadian casualties exceeded 400. On July 8, Canadians participated in Operation Charwood, a major assault on Caen.
2nd Canadian
Corps commanded by Lieutenant General Guy Simons attacked from the west while British forces attacked from the north. The assault followed massive aerial bombardment that dropped 2,500 tons of bombs on German positions.
Canadian
Infantry and armor pushed into northern Caen suburbs. House-to-house fighting lasted 3 days.
Canadians used mouse hauling tactics developed at Ortona.
By July 9, Canadian forces controlled
northern Caen. The city was not fully liberated until August, but the July
offensive broke German defensive lines and opened routes for Allied breakout operations.
The breakthrough came in
August with Operation Totalize, a Canadian-led assault designed to punch through German defenses south of Caen. General Simons planned the operation personally, developing innovative tactics, including night attacks with armored columns guided by radio beacons and tracer fire.
Simons understood daylight attacks against prepared German
positions resulted in massive casualties.
Attacking at night would negate German defensive advantages. He solved coordination challenges with technology and discipline. Radio beacons marked assembly areas. Tracer rounds, fired at precise intervals, marked direction. Pathfinder tanks with specialized navigation equipment led each column.
On the night of August 7, 800 Canadian and Polish tanks and armored vehicles attacked German positions under darkness. The assault achieved complete surprise.
German
defenders expecting only daylight attacks were overwhelmed.
Anti-tank guns could not target what they could not see.
Canadian armored columns smashed through defensive positions, advanced 7
kilometers in 12 hours, and created gaps in German lines that infantry exploited. The following day, German commanders reacted quickly.
By August 8, Tiger
tanks from 1st SS Panzer Corps counterattacked.
The next 3 days saw intense tank
battles across open farmland south of Caen. Canadian and Polish forces fought
German armor in running engagements, destroying hundreds of vehicles.
The fighting demonstrated Canadian ability to conduct complex armored operations at corps level. Operation Tractable followed on August 14. Another Simons plan.
Offensive aimed at closing the Files Gap. Canadian forces attacked in daylight but used smoke screens to blind
German defensive positions.
Heavy bombers dropped thousands of tons of bombs on German rear areas while artillery fired continuous barges. Canadian infantry and armor pushed south toward Files while American forces
advanced north from the opposite direction. The goal was encircling German 7th Army and 5th Panzer Army.
By August 16, Canadian and Polish forces reached Files.
The gap between Canadian and American forces narrowed to just km. Thousands of German soldiers tried escaping through the shrinking corridor. Allied artillery and air power inflicted devastating casualties.
The final closure of the Files Gap became controversial among historians. Some argue Montgomery or Bradley should have closed the pocket faster.
Others point out Canadian and Polish forces fought continuously for 2 weeks under intense pressure and closed the gap as quickly as tactically possible. The debate obscures the accomplishment. Canadian forces helped destroy the German force defending Normandy since D-Day.
Between 50,000 and 100,000 German soldiers were killed, wounded or
captured in the Falaise pocket. German combat power in France collapsed.
Without the Falaise victory, German forces might have established new defensive lines, prolonging the campaign.
4 months.
By the end of August 1944, Canadian First Army operating as an independent formation under General Harry Corps had proven itself repeatedly. The true test of Canadian capabilities came in September and October with the Battle of the Scheldt, which would become the most important Canadian military operation of the entire war.
After Paris liberation, Allied forces advanced rapidly across France and Belgium.
By early September, British forces captured Belgian port city Antwerp with dock facilities intact.
Antwerp was the second largest port in Europe, capable of handling enormous supply volumes. 1. Problem remained. Antwerp sat at the end of an 80 km river. Este controlled by German forces until the Scheldt Este was cleared. Antwerp remained useless. Montgomery gave the shell mission to Canadian First Army.
It was considered necessary but miserable work.
The
terrain was polar country, land reclaimed from the sea below sea level and crisscrossed with canals and dikes. Germans had flooded large areas, turning the battlefield into mud and water maze.
Defensive positions were exceptionally strong. German 15th Army commanded by
General Gustav von Zangen had orders to hold the Scheldt at all costs.
Von Zangen
had experienced troops, excellent positions, and terrain favoring defense.
Canadian commanders knew the operation would be costly.
The attack required clearing 4 separate areas.
First, the
Brands pockets south of the Este.
Second, the South Beaverland Peninsula.
Third, Walcheren Island at the estuary mouth.
Fourth, the area north of Antwerp. Each presented unique challenges. Canadian 2nd Infantry Division attacked the Branson's Pocket. On October 2nd,
the assault began with amphibious landing across the Brockman Inlet, bypassing German defenses along the Leopold Canal.
Canadian infantry came ashore in Buffalo, amphibious vehicles under heavy German fire. The landing succeeded, but follow-up operations bogged down in flooded fields and fierce German resistance. Every
village, dike, and canal crossing required hard fighting.
Canadian casualties mounted steadily. Terrain was
so difficult, tanks were useless. Infantry advanced through waist-deep water under constant artillery and
mortar fire.
The worst day for Canadian forces came October 13.
The Black
Watch Regiment from Montreal attacked a German position at Voindre, a village
controlling access to South Bend Peninsula. German forces including 6th Parachute Regiment defended with determination.
The Black Watch advanced across open ground under heavy fire.
The attack failed.
The regiment suffered 145 casualties, including 56 killed.
German forces captured 27 more.
It was devastating loss for a single battalion.
In one day.
Despite setbacks, Canadians continued fighting.
By late October, they cleared the Brands Pocket and advanced onto South Beaverland Peninsula. The final phase was assaulting Walcheren Island. British forces conducted amphibious landings at West Capel and Flushing while Canadian troops attacked across the narrow causeway connecting South Beaverland to Walter.
The causeway assault became
legendary in Canadian military history. The causeway was 40 m wide, elevated
above flooded fields on both sides with no cover. German forces had perfect fields of fire along the entire length.
Canadian units attacked repeatedly between October 31 and November 2. Each attack was repulsed with heavy casualties.
The Calgary Highlanders lost nearly an entire company in a single
assault. Yet attacks continued. Canadian commanders knew the causeway had to be taken to draw German attention from amphibious landings. On November 2,
British and Canadian forces converged on Walcheren from multiple directions.
German defenders realized they were surrounded. Organized resistance collapsed November 8. The Battle of the Scheldt lasted 5 weeks. Canadian First Army, including British and Polish
units, suffered 12,873 casualties.
6,367 were Canadian. Canadian 2nd Infantry Division alone lost 3,650
men in 33 days, but the mission succeeded.
On November 28, the first Allied convoy entered Antwerp, led by Canadian-built freighter Fort Cataraqui. Antwerp became the primary supply base for Allied forces driving into Germany.
Without Antwerp, the Allied advance would have stalled. Without the Scheldt operation, Antwerp would have remained
unusable.
American historian Charles MacDonald wrote that the Scheldt operation
demonstrated Canadian Army's ability to conduct complex multi-phase operations in worst possible terrain against determined opposition.
British historian Terry Kopp called the Scheldt one of the most grueling and significant battles
fought by Canadian forces in World War II. The battle proved Canadian commanders could plan and execute major missions independently, and Canadian soldiers could overcome any challenge through skill, courage, and determination.
By early 1945, Canadian First Army was recognized as
one of premier formations in Allied order of battle.
The final test came with Netherlands' liberation, a campaign
that would cement Canada's reputation and create bonds of friendship lasting generations. After the Scheldt victory, Canadian forces spent winter 1944 to 1945 holding defensive positions along
the Mars River
for 3 months between November 8, 1944 and February 8, 1945. Canadians were not involved in large-scale operations. Rest was desperately needed.
The 3rd Canadian Infantry Division and 2nd Canadian
Armored Brigade had been fighting since D-Day. Other units joined in July. 5
months of continuous combat had devastated battalions through killed, wounded, and battle exhaustion.
Casualties.
In February 1945, Allies launched the Great Offensive to drive
Germans back over the Rhine and bring about Germany's final defeat. 1st Canadian Army under General Corps was
strengthened with Allied formations, making it the largest army a Canadian officer ever commanded in action.
The
Army advanced from Nijmegen salient southeastward to clear the corridor between Rhin and Mars rivers.
Fighting
through February and March in what became known as the Battle of the Rhineland, Canadian forces faced appalling terrain conditions. Historian Dwight Eisenhower wrote to CRA expressing admiration for conducting the
attack under conditions more difficult than probably any assault in the war. It
spoke volumes for Canadian skill, determination, and soldier valor that they carried it through to successful
conclusion. On March 23, 1945, Allies launched Operation Plunder, crossing the Rhin River.
Canadian engineers played crucial roles building Bailey pontoon bridges and floating prefabricated
bridges into position.
By March end, Canadian units moved north, taking
Emmerich on the Rhin's right bank. On April 1, 1st Canadian Corps under
Major General Charles Folks replaced 1st British Corps under Canadian First Army Command, giving Corps direct control
of both Canadian Corps for the first time since Normandy.
After crossing the Rhine, Canadian First Army received 2
tasks. First, liberate Western Netherlands. Second, march through northeastern Netherlands and northern Germany to the Weser River.
The Western Netherlands task proved particularly
urgent.
Dutch civilians had suffered through the hunger winter of 1944 to
1945. In retaliation for a railway workers' strike, Germans banned all inland freight movement.
This prevented food grown in the north from reaching southern and western population centers.
Approximately 18,000 Dutch civilians starved to death. Millions more suffered severe malnutrition in what became the most devastating famine in Dutch history. Canadian forces launched liberation operations in early April. 2nd Canadian Infantry Division attacked northeastern Netherlands, liberating cities including Almelo on April 5, Zutphen on April 8, Deventer on April 12, and Groningen on April 16.
The Battle of Groningen saw intense urban fighting as Canadian troops cleared German defenders house by house and street by street.
German forces fought tenaciously despite knowing the war was lost. Every street corner became a potential ambush point. Every building required clearing. Canadian soldiers used experience gained at Ortona and in Normandy urban fighting to methodically reduce German strongpoints.
The liberation of Arnhem came between April
12th and 16th. This was the city British paratroopers tried desperately to hold during Operation Market Garden in September 1944. That operation failed catastrophically, with British 1st Airborne Division nearly annihilated. Now Canadian forces supported by British 49th Infantry Division and armor from 5th Canadian Armoured Division took the city in 4 days of coordinated operations. Canadian engineers demonstrated remarkable skill building Bailey bridges under fire and floating prefabricated bridges into position across the Jazel and Niederrhein rivers, allowing armor to cross faster than Germans expected. Canadian pioneers laid heavy artillery smoke screens over Arnhem during the attack, deceiving Germans about the true crossing. Direction: 1st Canadian Corps operations in Western Netherlands focused on liberating Amsterdam, Rotterdam, and The Hague. Dutch civilians in this densely populated area had suffered most during the Hunger Winter. Canadian forces faced delicate challenges. Using overwhelming firepower against German positions would reduce Canadian casualties, but endanger Dutch civilians living in close proximity. Canadian commanders chose to minimize artillery use and rely more heavily on infantry tactics, even though this increased their own casualties. Dutch civilians' welfare took priority. On April 17, 1st Canadian Corps liberated April Dawn. A 7-year-old girl named Elizabeth Calf was among the liberated citizens. A unit of the Royal Canadian Corps of Signals stationed in April Dawn adopted her as an honorary captain, presenting her with captain's rank insignia and unit shoulder flashes. Her mother sewed these onto a blue sweater that Lisp wore every day for years, a tangible symbol of Canadian kindness during liberation. By April 21, Canadian forces reached the North Sea, having captured Zoll and Leedan along the way. The 2nd Canadian Corps then turned east toward German towns of Emden, Wilhelmshaven, and Oldenburg, clearing the German coast of remaining Wehrmacht forces. On April 28, Germans agreed to a truce allowing movement of food supplies to starving Dutch populations behind the Greeby Line. Canadian forces and Allied air forces immediately began Operation Manor and Operation Chowhound, dropping food supplies to desperate civilians. These mercy missions prevented thousands more deaths in the final days before German surrender. On May 4, Canadian soldiers received messages to halt all operations with ceasefire effective at 0800 hours. May 5, General Falk, commander of 1st Canadian Corps, accepted the surrender of German forces in the Netherlands on May 5. On May 7, Germany unconditionally surrendered. The war in Europe officially ended. Canadian soldiers who had fought since Sicily or Normandy could finally rest. Stuart Johns of the Canadian Grenadier Guards remembered the moment. The relief was overwhelming, yet tinged with sorrow for comrades who died in the final weeks of a war everyone knew was ending. Canadian forces were greeted as heroes throughout the Netherlands. Jubilant crowds thronged streets mobbing liberating soldiers. Dutch civilians showered Canadians with flowers, kisses, and gratitude. The spontaneous celebrations became known as the Sweetest Spring. Civilians surrounding Sherman tanks, children riding on armored vehicles, entire families embracing Canadian soldiers, became iconic images of liberation. The gratitude was genuine and profound. Dutch people had endured 5 years of brutal occupation and near starvation. Canadian soldiers brought not just military liberation but food, medical supplies, and hope. More than 7,600 Canadian service personnel died during Netherlands operations from September 1944 through May 1945. This represented significant sacrifice in the war's final months. Many Canadians killed in April 1945 died, knowing victory was imminent but unable to see it. Private Harry Broad was killed by German artillery in April Dawn. On April 15, the same bombardment destroyed Dutch civilian Nellie van Denberg's house. After the war, she wrote to Harry's widow, Ruth Broad, telling her about his death and expressing gratitude for Canadian sacrifice. Such personal connections between Dutch civilians and Canadian families became common. The Netherlands' liberation created bonds between Canada and the Netherlands that endure today. Dutch schools teach children about Canadian liberation. Canadian War cemeteries in the Netherlands, including Gross Canadian War Cemetery, are maintained impeccably with Dutch volunteers tending graves. Every year on May 4th and 5th, Dutch citizens hold remembrance ceremonies honoring Canadian liberators. Thousands of Dutch women married Canadian soldiers, becoming war brides who immigrated to Canada. Princess Juliana of the Netherlands took refuge in Canada during the war, and her daughter Princess Margaret was born in Ottawa in January 1943. Canadian Parliament declared her hospital room extraterritorial, ensuring the child retained Dutch citizenship. In gratitude, the Netherlands sends 100,000 tulip bulbs to Canada annually. Ottawa's Canadian Tulip Festival celebrates this enduring friendship. Leadership made the difference. Lieutenant General Guy Simons became one of the finest corps commanders of the war. He was innovative, aggressive, willing to adopt new tactics and technologies. His night armored assault for Operation Totalize influenced armored doctrine for decades. Montgomery, despite his difficult personality, recognized Simons' abilities and gave him operational independence uncommon for Commonwealth commanders. Major General Christopher Vaux, who commanded 1st Canadian Infantry Division in Italy, was blunt, tough, and effective. His soldiers respected him because he shared their dangers and ensured they had necessary support. Individual Canadian soldiers demonstrated extraordinary courage throughout the war. Captain Paul Trey of the Royal 22nd Regiment earned the Victoria Cross at Casa Berardi in Italy on December 14, 1943. His company attacked a German strongpoint and was reduced to 14 men and 4 tanks by heavy fire. Trey personally led remaining troops forward, captured the position, and held it against repeated counterattacks for 24 hours. Private Ernest Smith of the Seth Highlanders earned the Victoria Cross near the Savio River in Italy on October 21, 1944. When his section came under fire from 2 German tanks and multiple machine guns, Smith grabbed a P-80 anti-tank weapon, destroyed 1 tank, drove off the second, and single-handedly attacked machine gun positions. Major John Mahoney of the Westminster Regiment earned the Victoria Cross in the Mela River crossing in Italy on May 24, 1944. He led his company across the river under heavy fire, established a bridgehead, and held it against German counterattacks for 6 hours despite being wounded twice. These Victoria Cross recipients represented thousands of Canadian soldiers who fought with equal courage in less recognized circumstances. Every Canadian division had men who performed extraordinary acts in combat. Canadian Army capability was built on these individuals, soldiers who refused to accept defeat even when odds were against them. Why were Canadian capabilities underestimated initially? Part of the answer lies in inexperience. The Canadian Army had not fought a major war since 1918. By 1939, the Army had shrunk to fewer than 5,000 regular soldiers. Building an army from scratch takes time, and Canadian forces spent years training before seeing combat. The DEP disaster in 1942 reinforced perceptions that Canadian soldiers were brave but poorly led and insufficiently prepared. But that perception ignored reality. After DEP, the Canadian Army conducted comprehensive analysis of what went wrong. Major General John Hamilton Roberts, who commanded at DEP, was removed from combat command. Training intensified with focus on combined arms coordination. Tactical doctrine was revised based on lessons learned at terrible cost. New equipment was issued and soldiers trained extensively. When Canadian forces landed in Sicily in July 1943, they were a different army than the one that attacked DEP. Better led, better trained, better equipped. By D-Day, they were a mature, professional force capable of executing complex operations under worst conditions. Another factor was prejudice. British and American commanders viewed Commonwealth forces, particularly Canadian and Australian units, as colonial troops, enthusiastic but lacking professional army sophistication. This prejudice was rarely stated openly, but influenced planning decisions. Canadian units were often assigned to secondary objectives or defensive roles. When Canadian forces proved their capabilities in combat, prejudice gave way to respect, but grudgingly. Even after the war, Canadian contributions were often downplayed in British and American military histories. Books about D-Day focus on Omaha Beach and American heroism. Books about the Italian Campaign emphasize British and American operations.
Canadian achievements are mentioned but rarely given deserved
Prominence, yet evidence is clear.
On D-Day, Canadians advanced furthest.
In
Italy, Canadians fought through the Gustav Line and Hitler Line. In Normandy, Canadians closed the Fallets
Gap. At the Scheldt, Canadians opened Antwerp. These were not minor contributions.
These were decisive operations directly affecting the war outcome. The port of Antwerp alone justified Canadian casualties in the Scheldt.
Without Antwerp, Allied logistics would have been crippled going into winter 1944.
The German offensive that became the Battle of the Bulge specifically targeted Antwerp because German
commanders understood its importance.
Canadian forces fought throughout the war at the same level as elite British and American divisions.
In some operations, they performed better.
This was not luck, this was capability built through training, leadership, innovation, and determination to prove doubters wrong. The statistics tell part of the story. More than 1 million Canadians served in uniform during World War II from a population of only 11
million.
The Canadian Army sent 5 divisions overseas, plus independent brigades, armored regiments, and
supporting units. Canadian forces fought for 5 years from 1940 through 1945.
42,000 Canadians died in service during the war.
22,900 were Army personnel. For a nation of 11 million people, those numbers represent extraordinary sacrifice. But numbers alone do not capture capability.
Capability is measured in battlefield results.
On D-Day, 3rd Canadian
Infantry Division advanced further inland than any other Allied division.
At Ortona in Italy, fought through house-to-house combat against German paratroopers and secured a key position on the Gustav Line. At Fallets, Canadian troops helped close the gap that trapped German 7th Army.
At the Scheldt, Canadian forces accomplished
the mission that opened Antwerp and enabled Allied logistics for the final drive into Germany. Montgomery himself,
initially skeptical of Canadian capabilities, changed his assessment after witnessing Canadian combat
performance.
By late 1944, he considered General Simons one of the finest corps
commanders in Allied and armies.
Montgomery later wrote that the Canadian Army learned to fight effectively under
his command.
While Montgomery's assessment was characteristically self-serving, it acknowledged Canadian
forces evolved into a highly professional combat army. What Montgomery failed to fully credit was that Canadians did not simply follow British doctrine, they innovated. Mouse-hauling tactics used at Ortona and in
Normandy became standard urban warfare techniques studied by military minds after
the war.
Night armored assault tactics developed by Simons for Operation Totalize influenced armored doctrine for
decades.
Canadian military engineering, particularly in amphibious and river crossing operations, set standards for
combined arms operations. The deeper question is why Canadian capabilities were underestimated. Initially, beyond inexperience and prejudice, there was the DEP factor.
That disaster reinforced perceptions that Canadian soldiers were brave but poorly led and insufficiently prepared
for modern warfare. But perception ignored what happened after DEP. The
Canadian Army conducted ruthless self-examination. They identified every tactical error, every coordination failure, every equipment deficiency. They corrected those problems through 2 years of intensive training.
When
Canadian forces landed in Sicily in July 1943, they were fundamentally different
from the force that attacked DEP.
Better leadership, better tactics, better integration of infantry, armor, and artillery. By D-Day, they were a mature professional force.
Canadian
contributions were often downplayed in post-war histories written by British and American authors.
Books focus on Omaha Beach, Market Garden, the Bulge. Canadian operations receive mentions but rarely detailed analysis.
This historiographical bias obscures the
reality. Canadian forces fought some of the war's toughest battles. Ortona was
as brutal as any urban combat in Europe. The Scheldt was as difficult as any campaign fought in Northwest Europe.
Fallets was as important as any encirclement operation of the war.
These battles directly affected the war's
outcome, yet remain relatively unknown outside Canada.
The Canadian Army's transformation from 1939 to 1945.
represents one of the war's remarkable military developments. Canada entered the war with fewer than 5,000 regular Army personnel.
By war's end, over 1 million Canadians had served in uniform.
From a population of 11 million,
the Army fielded 5 full divisions overseas, multiple independent armored brigades, artillery regiments, and extensive support formations.
This expansion required not just recruitment,
but developing professional officer corps, establishing effective training systems, and creating logistical infrastructure to support forces fighting on multiple continents simultaneously. The quality of Canadian military leadership evolved dramatically.
Early war commanders like Major General Andrew McNorton focused on keeping Canadian forces together as a national formation rather than dispersing them
under British command.
While this preserved Canadian identity, it also delayed combat deployment. McNorton's
replacement by practical combat commanders like Crowar and Simons marked a shift toward aggressive innovative leadership focused on winning battles rather than preserving autonomy.
Simons,
in particular, proved himself among the war's finest corps commanders through tactical innovation and willingness to
adopt new technologies and methods. Canadian tactical innovations influenced
Allied warfare beyond immediate battlefield results.
The mouse-hauling technique developed at Ortona became
standard urban warfare doctrine studied worldwide.
Night armored assaults pioneered by Simons for Operation Totalize demonstrated that properly coordinated armor could attack successfully in darkness, negating
defensive advantages of anti-tank guns.
Canadian military engineers set standards for rapid bridge construction and river crossing operations that influenced post-war military engineering
worldwide. These innovations emerged from necessity combined with willingness to experiment rather than rigidly
following established doctrine.
The cost of Canadian achievement was substantial.
42,000 Canadians died during World War II. 22,900 were Army personnel.
Approximately 60,000 were wounded.
These casualties
came from a nation of 11 million people, representing sacrifice proportionally comparable to much larger nations.
Every Canadian community contributed soldiers. Farm towns in Saskatchewan, fishing
villages in Nova Scotia, industrial cities in Ontario and Quebec, all sent young men who never returned.
The human cost extended beyond statistics to thousands of families permanently marked by loss. Canadian military capability in
World War II must be measured against both achievements and context.
Canadian forces fought some of the war's toughest battles. Ortona earned comparison to Stalingrad for urban fighting intensity.
The Scheldt challenged troops with terrain as difficult as any in Europe.
Juno Beach on D-Day had defenses second only to Omaha in strength.
In every case, Canadian forces succeeded often at heavy cost, but always accomplishing assigned objectives. This achievement came despite initial inexperience, skepticism from allies, and limited resources compared to British and American forces.
Context is essential when evaluating Canadian performance. Canadian soldiers were predominantly volunteers serving far from home.
They received extensive preparation, yet most had never experienced combat before Sicily or Normandy. They faced veteran German troops who had fought on multiple fronts. Despite these challenges, Canadian forces consistently performed at levels matching or surpassing more seasoned Allied formations. This demonstrates the quality of training, effectiveness of leadership, and determination of the soldiers. The relationship between Canadian forces and Allied command remained complicated throughout the conflict.
Montgomery's patronizing attitude toward Canadian commanders generated tensions that persisted despite battlefield successes.
American generals largely overlooked Canadian contributions in post-war memoirs and histories. British military historians often minimized Canadian roles in operations, highlighting British and American efforts instead. This historiographical bias means Canadian accomplishments remain underappreciated outside Canada despite their significance. Modern military historians increasingly acknowledge Canadian contributions. Works by Terry Kopp, Mark Sulka, and others have documented Canadian operations with thorough detail and analysis comparable to studies of American and British forces. These historians show that Canadian divisions fought as effectively as any Allied formation and sometimes outperformed formations with greater resources and experience. science. Academic recognition is gradually correcting popular misconceptions, yet public awareness remains limited. The enduring Canadian-Dutch friendship represents perhaps the most tangible legacy of Canadian military service.
No other allied nation maintains such enduring bonds with a liberated country decades after the conflict.
Dutch gratitude stems from Canadian sacrifice during liberation and subsequent occupation duties, where Canadian soldiers treated civilians with respect and compassion. Canadian troops shared scarce rations with starving civilians, provided medical care, and maintained discipline, preventing the looting and abuse sometimes seen with other armies. These actions created lasting goodwill beyond mere military liberation. Canadian veterans returned home profoundly changed. Men who left as farm boys or factory workers returned having witnessed the brutality of combat and European devastation.
Many struggled with what today would be recognized as post-traumatic stress disorder. Others channeled wartime experiences into post-war careers and community service.
Company Sergeant Major Charles Martin exemplified this pattern, returning to his Ontario community to serve as school trustee, volunteer, and local leader while maintaining a government job and operating a small business with his wife. His memoir, written 50 years after D-Day, ensured the experiences of his generation would be preserved for future Canadians. The question of Canadian Army capability in World War II has a clear answer based on historical evidence. The Canadian Army was highly competent, demonstrated through consistent success in challenging operations across multiple theaters over 5 years of conflict. From Sicily through Italy, from Juno Beach through Falaise, from the Scheldt to the liberation of the Netherlands, Canadian forces achieved every major objective assigned. Despite initial inexperience and skepticism from allies, they innovated tactically, fought tenaciously, and earned respect through battlefield performance rather than reputation or resources.
This capability stemmed from specific factors. Rigorous training over 4 years before major combat operations thoroughly prepared soldiers. Lessons from the Dieppe disaster were analyzed exhaustively and corrected.
Leadership evolved from cautious staff officers to aggressive combat commanders willing to innovate.
Soldiers fought with determination born from the knowledge that their nation's reputation and their comrades' lives depended on success.
The combination of preparation, learning from failure, strong leadership, and soldier resolve produced an army capable of matching any in the world despite limited resources in peacetime military tradition.
Canadian military history deserves greater international recognition.
The Canadian Army in World War II represents a small nation making disproportionately significant contributions to Allied victory.
Canadian divisions fought in key battles across Europe. Canadian sacrifices helped liberate millions from Nazi occupation.
Canadian innovations influenced military tactics worldwide. Yet, these contributions remain relatively obscure outside Canada because post-war narratives emphasized American and British roles while minimizing Commonwealth efforts. On June 6, 1944, Company Sergeant Major Charles Martin led his men ashore at Brignais-sur-Mer. With the reputation of Canada at stake, Allied commanders doubted whether Canadians could succeed where Dieppe had failed catastrophically. By nightfall, the 3rd Canadian Infantry Division had advanced further inland than any other Allied division, secured all objectives, and proven their critics wrong. That pattern repeated throughout the war. Initially underestimated, Canadians repeatedly demonstrated capability through battlefield success, from inexperienced divisions in 1939 to battle-hardened formations liberating the Netherlands. In 1945, the Canadian Army earned its reputation one engagement at a time.
If you found this story compelling, take a moment to like this video.
Your support helps share these overlooked stories from the Second World War. Subscribe to stay connected with untold histories that shaped our world.
Every story matters.
Every sacrifice deserves to be remembered.
Leave a comment below telling us where you are watching from.
Our community includes viewers worldwide, from veterans to history enthusiasts, all united in respect for those who served.
Thank you for watching and for preserving these stories.